Assalamu alaikum guys, I hope you're doing well. Let me see. Okay. Assalamu alaikum guys, I hope you're doing well. So in this video we are going to discuss about the vulnerability assessment. Few of the questions related to vulnerability assessment. So the first question is, what is the difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing? So the answer is that vulnerability assessment is the process of identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing vulnerabilities in a system, network, or application. It involves automated tools and manual techniques to scan for known vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, and other issues, security issues. Now, these results are analyzed to prioritize the vulnerabilities based on their severity and potential impact. So it is a severity and the potential impact. So penetration testing, on the other hand, it simulates real world attacks to exploit identified vulnerabilities, aiming to understand how an attacker could gain unauthorized access, what data could be compromised, and the extent of potential network infiltration. So, for example, a company conducts a vulnerability assessment to identify security weakness in their networks. They find the vulnerabilities such as the outdated softwares and misconfigured firewalls. Based on this assessment, they prioritize fixing the most critical. Later, they perform the penetration test to see if the vulnerabilities can be exploited and to understand the potential impact of the attack. So that is, in a nutshell, the difference between vulnerability assessment and the penetration testing. So keep in mind that in order to do a successful penetration testing, you have to first perform the vulnerability assessment. So first, then you have to know what are the vulnerabilities are in the system, which vulnerabilities are critical, and which vulnerability could leverage, unauthorized access on some potential confidential systems. So those are the things which you do first, and then you go with the penetration testing. So the second question is, what is the common tools used for vulnerability assessment? So there are a lot of tools in the market. So some of the common tools which include Nessus, which is owned by Tenable on enterprise level. Then you have OpenVAS, which is a open source vulnerability assessment tool, and you also have Qualys Guard. Nessus is widely used for identifying vulnerabilities and compliance issues. OpenVAS, like I said, is an open source tool for comprehensive vulnerability scanning and management. Qualys Guard is a cloud-based platform offering continuous monitoring and vulnerability management. So let's take an example. So let's say a security team uses Nessus to scan their network for vulnerabilities. They discover several critical issues such as unpatched software and weak password. They then use OpenVAS to perform a more detailed scan and verify the finding from Nessus. So that's also an approach you can take with regards to various tools that is available in the market now. So the third question is, how do you prioritize the vulnerabilities based on severity? So you have a lot of vulnerabilities being reported. So how do you prioritize that? So vulnerabilities are prioritized based on factors such as the potential impact on the system, the likelihood of exploitation, and the value of the asset at risk. Common severity levels include critical, high, medium, and low. So these are the severity levels like critical, high, medium, and low. So for example, let's say a vulnerability assessment identify a critical vulnerability in a web application that could allow an attacker to gain full control of the servers. Now this vulnerability is given the highest priority for remediation due to its severity, impact, and high likelihood of the exploitation. So let's try to understand in this way. So let's say you have a web servers, okay, which is a asset, right? The server is an asset for you because it is serving web pages. Maybe it's an e-commerce website, and it is serving, it's act as a business for you for generating the revenue. So that is an asset, and of course it is publicly available. So because of course this is public available, that's the reason people are able to access your website and purchase any goods and product from that website. Okay, so now the server, that asset that you have is at risk because it is publicly available. And if you have done any vulnerability assessment using any of the tools that we discussed, like for example Nessus, Qualys, or OpenVAS, and you found out critical vulnerabilities, right? So let's say your application, like for example, which will give an attacker full control of the servers. Now, this vulnerability will be given high priority for remediation because the asset is of high value, which is at risk. And the second thing is that this exploit, if the exploit is publicly available, okay, so of course any attacker or even unskilled attacker can use the exploit, right, and can take down your server, then can get full control of the server. So this is the high priority vulnerabilities. You have to mitigate them because your asset is of great high value, then this exploit is publicly available, and the rating of this vulnerability is critical because it will allow an attacker to gain full control of the servers, and that's how you prioritize vulnerabilities based on severity. All right, the second question is the next question is, explain the concept of false positive and false negative in vulnerability assessment. So a false positive occurs when a vulnerability scanner incorrectly identifies a non-existent vulnerabilities, and a false negative occurs when a vulnerability scanner fails to detect an actual vulnerabilities. So let's take an example. During a vulnerability scan, the scanner flags a vulnerability in a system that is actually patched and secure, false positive. Conversely, it fails to detect an unpatched vulnerability in other systems, so that's a false negative. So basically, false positive is like, you run a Tenable or any kind of vulnerability assessment tools against a particular server, and it says that there is a vulnerability in that particular server, but in reality there is no vulnerability in the server. Okay, so that is a false positive. So um your Tenable or any one VA tool is giving you as alert that there is a vulnerability, but in fact there is no vulnerability. That is a false positive. On the other hand, false negative is when there was actually a vulnerability on the server, but your VA tool does not give you an alert saying that there is a vulnerability existing on that particular server. So that is a false negative. All right, let's move to another question. What are the key components of vulnerability assessment? So key components include like planning and scope definition, information gathering, vulnerability scanning, manual verification and analysis, reporting, and remediation recommendations. So it involves planning, what are the scope within which other servers which will be in the scope of vulnerability assessment. Then you have to gather information about those assets. Then you have to do scanning against those assets. Then you have to do manual verification, analysis, reporting, and remediation recommendation. So, for example, a company plans a vulnerability assessment by defining the scope to include their web servers and their internal network. Now they gather information about the target environment through passive and active reconnaissance. Then they use automated tools to scan for vulnerabilities and manually verifying the findings. Finally, they generate a report with recommendation for remediation. So that's what are these are the components which include in a vulnerability assessment. The next question is, how can you determine the severity of a vulnerability? Um, so previously we looked about like we have severity, and based on this, how do we prioritize the vulnerability that we have found? Now this question is basically saying, how do you basically determine the severity of a vulnerability? So when you say like this is a high severity level vulnerabilities, how do you basically determine that? How do you classify that as a high, low, or whatever be the severity of that particular vulnerability? So the answer is that the severity of a vulnerability is determined by factors such as its potential impact on the system, the likelihood of exploitation, and the value of asset as risk. So again, the common severity levels include like critical, high, medium, and low. So example would be a vulnerability assessment, which identify a vulnerability in a database server that could allow attacker to gain access to sensitive customer data. Now this severity is determined to be critical due to its high potential impact and the value of the data as risk. All right, let's dig into the next question, which is, What is the difference between black box and white box and gray box testing? So black box testing involves testing without the knowledge of the internal working of the system. White box testing involves testing with full knowledge of the system's internal structure and source code. Gray box testing involves testing with partial knowledge of the system, combining accept of both black and white box testing. So for example, let's say a security teams perform black box testing on the web applications and simulate an external attacker, because the external attacker doesn't have any access to the internal network. So it's like you're completely blind, you don't know anything about it, and you are performing a security testing. Okay, so that is a black box. Uh, then they perform white box testing to understand the application internal structure. So you are given access to the internal network, you are given information like we have this and this servers having this and this running operating systems and all the IP addresses and details to perform the testing. So that is a white box testing. All right, so this is the difference between black, white and gray. So that's it for this video guys, and I will see you guys in another video. Until next time, assalamu alaikum.